So webinar is now broadcasting. We have 25 participants so far, 30, this number will continue to grow. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see that? Everybody see this? The welcome screen?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, that's got us at 12 noon, so I'll go ahead and kick off the webinar. Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from, and welcome to the Tree Funds webinar series. My name is Bo Broadbeck, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. I would first like to welcome you on behalf of the Alabama Cooperative Extension System, or the outreach arm for Auburn University. We are honored and excited to be hosting today's Tree Fund webinar. Second, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Tree Fund. I currently serve on the Board of Trustees and a variety of committees, including the Research Committee at Tree Fund. It's been a fantastic place to work, and I would like to share with you all a little bit about what we do at the Tree Fund and who the Tree Fund is for those who are not familiar with the Tree Fund. And so just before we get started into the formal webinar, I'm just going to give you all a brief introduction today. And so, sorry, my computer's a little delayed on my end, but so the Tree Fund supports scientific discovery and the dissemination of new knowledge in the fields of arboriculture and urban forestry. And they do this through a variety of means, primarily through grants, through new research. These research grants are primarily research in the applied field, so the types of research that impact many of the arborists working in our industry. The Tree Fund also supports scholarships for aspiring tree care professionals, as well as supports grants for arboriculture education to bring forth the next generation of arborists in our field. The revenue sources for the Tree Fund come from a variety of areas, but primarily through individual donations from people like you and I. You might be supporting the Tree Fund through some of their community engagement events like the Tour de Trees, which raises usually over $300,000 a year from donations from arborists and companies around the country. Also through their after hours events and a variety of other activities that are held on the local chapter level. They also have endowment earnings and partnerships with a lot of our companies in our industry, and their legacy giving through the Heritage Oak Society. The research that the Tree Fund does focuses on a variety of research priority areas. Since 2002, they have awarded $4 million in the types of research related to root and soil management, plant healthcare, urban forestry, technology transfer, risk assessment, in worker safety, propagation, planting, and establishment. And in today's presentation, I think you'll get a more in-depth view of some of the past research that has been done at the Tree Fund. There's a variety of research grants that are available for researchers. These range from $10,000 grants to $50,000 grants. And every few years, we're trying to bring out some new available grants. Just this year, we have 2 new grants. We have the Bob Sciarra Memorial Fund grant for $25,000 and the Barbarinas Family Fund grant at $10,000. And we have grants that are focused in different areas. We have the Utility Arborist Research Fund for those in the utility industry. We have the Highland R. Johns grant, which is kind of one of our backbone research grants. And we also have things like the Jack Kimmel International Grant for some of our international colleagues. Now, there's also education grants and scholarships. Tree Fund has 5 scholarships available for aspiring students that are interested in entering our field. They can come from a variety of backgrounds, whether it's urban forestry, horticulture, landscape architecture. It's open to those students, as well as 1 educational grant through the Ohio chapter ISA education grant for $5,000. Now, I'd like to highlight that Tree Fund in the last year has made a lot of their archives easier to search. We have the research archives where you can search by researcher, by topic, and it's really a great place to see some of the work that Tree Fund has done over the last few years and kind of be familiar with the impacts they do. And I know that our 2 speakers are going to talk about this a little bit today. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And Rich, if you'll go ahead and share your screen, I'll start introducing you on the webinar. I have a couple of housekeeping items to bring up. There's a chat box at the bottom of your screen. Please, if you have any questions, type those questions. I'll be monitoring those, and we will bring those up to the 2 speakers at the end of the presentation today. We do have ISA and SAF CEUs available. I will place the ISA CEU code at the end of today's program, so please jot that down, and each of you will be responsible for submitting your own CEUs. For those needing SAF CEUs, I will use the registration information from today's webinar and submit those for you directly to SAF. So with that, I would like to introduce our 2 speakers today. The topic is Cultivating Innovation and Documenting 15 Years of Tree Fund Research Impacts. So really getting at the question of what has the Tree Fund done for us over the last 15 years. We have Andrew Koeser, who is a professor at the University of Florida's Gulf Coast Research and Education Center, where he conducts research on issues related to urban landscape sustainability, tree risk assessment, and storm failure prediction, and factors that influence urban tree growth and longevity. Andrew is a prolific researcher and writer, which has earned him ISA's 2017 R.W. Harris Author Citation Award and in 2015, the Early Career Scientist Award. Co-presenting with Andrew today is Dr. Rich Hauer. Rich Hauer is a professor of urban forestry at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and he teaches courses in urban forestry, nursery management, woody plants dendrology, and an introduction to forestry. He has recently been honored in 2018 by the L.C. Chadwick Award for Arboricultural Research. He has published over 130 publications and presented over 300 talks worldwide. I really appreciate the 2 of you joining us today to share some of the research that you all have conducted over the past year and a half. With that, Rich, I will turn the virtual floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bo. And can you see the screen?
I can.
Fantastic. So my pleasure to actually present with Dr. Koeser here today. Andrew and I will be tag teaming. We'll be going back and forth a couple times. And I'm controlling the module here, and Andrew will be helping to inform me to advance slides on occasion. So at first, how we got involved with this project was the Tree Fund had a request for researchers to actually evaluate the impact, outcomes, and outputs of the Tree Fund granting program. And so if you're not familiar with what an output is, it's very simple. Presentation or publication would be an example of an output from perhaps research. An outcome would be, what's the impact? So we may do a study on tree planting, and then the results actually make an impact where someone applies the science and it actually works. An impact is much like an outcome, but it's long lasting. And so you could take the research, and let's use tree planting or tree pruning is a really good example, and ANSI A300 standards, where the science of tree pruning is now being integrated into professional standards, which become a long-lasting impact. So those are a few terms that you may hear in and out over the next 50 minutes. The process for research involved a 15-year time frame. And this actually coincides with 2003 when the Tree Fund first started putting grants for researchers to actually submit an application and a proposal for funding. Prior to that, though, it was the granting program actually occurred, but it was with the ISA Research Trust Fund. We'll just make a brief mention to that historical part, but for most of our presentation, we'll be talking about this 15-minute time frame. And also another important impact of this grant evaluation process that Andrew and I did was actually to provide recommendations for the Tree Fund for their future directions for the research program. Now, to provide an understanding of priority areas that actually do get funding from the Tree Fund, they fall into 5 categories. And Bo made reference to this earlier here, where root and soil management, for example, is one area. So a researcher may want to know what's the impact of a soil treatment, maybe biochar, on the health of the plant. Planting an establishment is pretty self-explanatory. The processes that we do for planting trees and fostering tree survival and establishment. Plant healthcare, anything we do to maintain a healthy tree. A lot of different projects have been funded under that area, along with risk management and the safety of workers in the fields of arboriculture and urban forestry, along with the topical area of urban forestry, which is very broad. And urban forestry is kind of the management side of the care of trees, which arboriculture is a vital part of. So, the granting areas. Now, Bo made reference to 2 new grants that are coming out this year. The Barbarinas Family Fund, which is actually dedicated towards topical areas with nursery tree management, and the Bob Skira Memorial Fund, which is building bridges. So building the legacy between urban forestry and arboriculture and allied fields. Now, our study specifically addressed the Highland Johns and the John Dueling, which are the longest granting programs with the Tree Fund, along with the Jack Kimmel Utility Arborist Research Fund, Safe Arborist Techniques Fund, along with some directed grant programs. But primarily Highland Johns and John Dueling are the primary grants that have been issued over time. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, and he's going to be talking about our research methodology that went into our study.
Yeah, so thank you, Rich. So as Rich said, we went into 15 years of Tree Fund data and past research, and we wanted to see what patterns and impacts and outcomes there were from that. And originally we envisioned that we were going to send this massive survey out to all the past recipients, and they were going to diligently fill it all out and give us all this information. And we learned that those are very busy folks. Some of them are retired and some of them are no longer active in research. So it was kind of impossible. So we switched to gears and focused on the other parts of our proposal, which were to do a full review of the final reports, look at a citation search for past Tree Fund researchers, trying to get a master list of citations for everything that's come from the Tree Fund. Then we took those lists and we read through the papers, the abstracts at least, and did the content analysis of what was in those. And then finally, we did a key informant assessment, which is when I wish to talk about it a little bit more. We go to key industry contacts, other researchers and users of the Tree Fund research to get their take on all of this. Next slide, Rich. So a big thank you goes to Barb Duke for helping us with this. She gave us 115 final reports that were through the Tree Fund. These final reports were mostly from the later years of the 15-year cycle because they weren't part of the process initially when the grants were going out. We also had 111 successful proposals. Some of them had overlaps, some of them didn't. And these are just proposals that were submitted to the Tree Fund that they had copies of that we could read, see what was promised at least. And finally, we put all this together and we came up with 190 grants total that were funded in our 15-year period, unique awards. So a lot of the information we got from Barb was also on the research archive, and there were some differences and some similarities. So if you're curious to what the Tree Fund is funding, you can look through this yourself. What we've done in our report and what we did in this presentation is kind of summarize those findings. So next slide, Rich. And you can see here for an award, this is one that Ed Gilman got on the effective container size on the establishment and anchorage of trees. I know that he actually has this paper out already. I've read it this last week actually. And you can actually read more about the project and what took place in deliverables if you click on the read more button below that. Next. So what we did is we looked through all those sources of data and we wanted to find out all of this information to get a master list, a master accounting of all of the deliverables and things that came out of this. And we looked through just basic stuff regarding when the award happened and who were the PIs and stuff, looking towards, how many presentations did they give at the ISA conference or at their chapter? How many students did they mentor with the project? How many publications and where did they publish them? Did these things go into TCIA news or the Arborist news? All these different things to see what the impact of this money were. And then another thing we'll show in a little bit is did people actually get more money and enhance their projects with other funding based on the seed funds provided by the tree fund? Next, Rich. We also looked, once we knew we had 190 unique projects, and we had a fewer number of unique project PIs or leaders. And we looked at the list and we went through their individual websites that they had those. So folks like Rich Hauer or Ed Gilman here, they'll put their papers up on their website. So we were able to look at everything that they had published that they posted on their websites. That was one source of information. Next, Rich. When we're looking for citations, we're trying to get our master list of everything that the tree fund, all the papers that the tree fund helped create. We also looked at ResearchGate, which is kind of like a nerdy, Facebook for academics where they can post their research. If you are a non-researcher but you're interested in research and you just don't have access to journal articles and you're behind a paywall, this is a good thing to get into. You can just message people directly and they'll quickly send you a file that they have on hand, maybe proofs or something from a paper that they have, and you can access it yourself for the non-AUF papers, Arborist and Urban Forestry papers. Rich? And then we also looked at Google citations. Google Scholar, they allow researchers to kind of pull together their research, and once you set up a profile, it automatically populates it with your papers. This was another really good source of potential citations. And the good thing about Google Scholar is it picks up things like arboricultural and urban forestry or the Environmental Horticulture Journal, things that are not ISA listed, which means that they have a listing from some search engines. What it does is allow you to get some of the more common journals that we typically publish in that don't show up everywhere. It's a really good source, and sorry, I just looked at the comments, get distracted here. And what we did is we assembled all these papers and we looked through them and we wanted to see that if there was any reference to the tree fund in there. If they weren't specifically noted in their final report for the tree fund, we went through and made a lot of, like AUF, they'll have a little logo that says tree fund funded at the bottom, which is really cool. And we wanted to make sure that we got everything that was attributed to the tree fund in that. Sometimes, Susan Day wrote 7 papers on roots and we couldn't tell if 1 or 2 of those were from the tree fund. We just erred on the side of caution and didn't include those. So our estimates are pretty conservative. Rich? And then we also, because AUF is such a key, fixture in the research that comes out of the tree fund, we did do some dedicated searches with their search engine, just to make sure we didn't miss anything on Google Scholar. Next. And what we did with all this information is we have a list of all of the papers that we could attribute to the tree fund in one online database through Mendeley. So if anyone's ever interested in this and they want to read everything that the tree fund has to offer, you can just email us and we can actually send you all the citation lists. A lot of them have PDFs on there, as you can see that. And we can share that to you through Mendeley if you have an account, which is free to set up. So next, Rich.
All right, thank you, Andrew, for good introduction to the methods. One additional method that we did was a content analysis that Andrew talked about. And so all the abstracts and titles and keywords for papers were put in this coded system. We then actually used some key findings and common themes that we'll allude to as we present. We also used information about their professional background of such as being an ISA certified arborist, or maybe it was involved with best management practices, BMPs. So kind of a key output of this as an outcome.
Yeah, we
and
use like, we use the coding from the ISA domains, like the pruning, all the chapters in the ISA study guide as coding terms. So
yeah, thanks, Andrew. So as we went along with these codes, as you do science, additional information comes up. So we use these initial things such as the certified arborist and BMP codes. Additional ones did come up. For example, deep planting. That's not something you'll see as a test domain, but it was something that repeatedly came up through our findings. So key informant assessment. Now, a key informant would be someone that has expertise in the field. Now, for example, if we're asking folks about their opinion on the tree fund, we could go down the street and do a structure survey to ask people their opinion on the tree fund. Typically the non-practitioner, a person that's a lay person that doesn't work in the field, would probably have very little knowledge of the tree fund, so their best response might be, don't know. And so a key informant would take someone that has expertise in the field that you would then ask them succinct or questions that are defined to elicit some response to a question at hand. Now, as I pointed out, beyond the general population, these are folks that are practicing in the field. And for our particular purposes, we wanted to get a robust sample of folks from not only academia, but also from the various sectors of arboriculture and urban forestry. So at the public side, municipal forestry, utility foresters, we had practicing arborists on the private side, we had folks from nonprofit institutions. And so to get a broad basis of folks that have an understanding of the tree fund and to give us their unbiased observation of what they've observed through the tree fund. And so that we then use this insight and to evaluate the tree fund per se with these research questions. And we had a total of 25 people that we asked to be key informants. And here's where science sometimes drives you to a different approach. Initially, we had envisioned to have this very dynamic system where we called up one of the key informants and we asked them for their opinion on the matter. We called the first person, no answer. Called the second person, no answer. Did this a third time, a fourth time. After the eighth person and no answer, call us back later, got a voicemail. We soon realized this probably was not going to be the best approach. We actually structured a written approach along with having them provide their observation in a written format. In retrospect, actually, that was probably the best way to go because we not only got a very good understanding of we were asking the same questions that we'd ask in the structured format over the telephone, but they also provided in a written format that allowed us to easily capture the information and actually do a nice content analysis. The other aspect, we had a very desirable response rate. So we had 17 out of the 25, 2/3 of the folks actually did participate. So we're very happy with that. Along with it, did cover the various sectors that I'd mentioned. Now, what did we find with the research? So what you're going to find today, for those listening to our webinar, is not only findings of what the research outputs and outcomes and impacts are, but we're also going to provide some expertise that you'll find perhaps practical on some of the key findings from research. So from a tree fund basis, from 2003 to 2017, this is just a figure that shows the number of awards by year and actually through the various grants. You'll probably notice one particular year, 2003, we have this hatched reddish whitish bar that says unassigned. So one finding we found from our study was actually the tree fund has done a very good job of actually tracking the funding by source of grant. But the first year when they're putting their processes in place, that was just one area that they were either John Dooling or Highland John grants, and you could probably proportionally look at the bars over year, the other years, and say most of those unassigned are probably John Doolings, the others are Highland Johns. We can't say that to be exact, but we do know those unassigned ones from 03 did go into those particular areas. Now, another thing you may notice actually is the grants over time, the number of awards actually have declined. During the initial years, many of these grants were actually low value ones. And I shouldn't say low value from the aspect that the money was useless, but many of the grants were at the $5,000 level. So going back in the early years, there's many more awards, but they're at lower levels of financing. Now they are valuable, but a $25,000 grant, for example, would allow you to do a lot more with research, maybe funding several undergraduate students, perhaps funding a graduate student for a year. And so there's this trend of fewer grants issued in the present than in the past, but that is one of the outcomes of this was the funding level did increase. Now the next slide we have here is if you look at the amount of funding over time, when we did our study, it was $33.9 million in grants were issued during that first 15 years of the tree fund. Prior to the tree fund though, during the 15 years of the ISA Research Trust Fund, and actually adjusting this value for inflation to 2018 dollars, it was about $500,000 worth of grants. So one thing you can see is what did the tree fund do? It not only actually provided another mechanism for research funding, but it actually was able to get a lot more research dollars from the variety of ways that Bo mentioned that funds come in to support the tree fund to allow actually a many-fold, almost a tenfold increase of funding that went out. Now, what was one of the outputs of this was we found 175 peer-reviewed publications. We know these are funded because either the researchers told us this, or there's the tree fund logo on the research, or there's an acknowledgement in the acknowledgement section of the paper that funded by the tree fund. Now, there's probably more than 175. We do know for a fact there were some papers we looked at. We were pretty certain they were tree fund funded, but we could find no evidence to back it up. And so that number 175 is verified, and it probably is higher than that. On average, there is nearly 21 citations per paper. So a researcher would cite, the science from at a minimum on average 21 additional papers. Now, 56% of these papers are actually available in what we'd call open source journals. So arboriculture, urban forestry, after a year, anybody can get access to this research. And I'll show this in another figure here shortly. And another aspect is we looked at the leveraging of funds. And so for the tree fund, for every dollar that goes out to researchers, they actually turned around and were able to bring in at least $2.63 of leveraged resources to support funding. We also know this number is probably low because our data set was incomplete. And this was one of these numbers that as researchers, we could use what the researchers actually reported to us. We did know some examples we did know some external funding that was not in the database that would certainly increase this number. So at a minimum, for every dollar the tree fund provides to a researcher, $2.63 additional dollars are leveraged from that research monies. Now, if we look across the world, United States and North America by far has the greatest number of grants. But it's also been building as an international fund. For example, the Jack Kimmel Research Grant specifically says that this is a funding source for outside of the United States. And so you can look across the country or across the world of where the various grants have been issued. Now, here's a graph that shows projects that provided deliverables and projects that did not provide a deliverable. So during the initial period of the tree fund, we could cite one weakness was perhaps that projects either didn't deliver upon what they promised, or if they did deliver on what they promised, it wasn't documented. But as you can see in the recent time period, during the previous 5 years between, let's say, 2010, 2011, and 2015, that many of the projects that actually were issued by the tree fund, whatever was promised was delivered upon, which is a really important thing for the tree fund to be able to demonstrate that not only is research being funded, but what the researchers are promising, it is occurring. Now, if you look at the most recent 5-year time period, you may say, well, is the trend reversing itself? No, actually what it is we've got grants that are active. So for example, 2018, it'd be very unlikely that you'd probably have a grant that's already delivered on their project, but in fact, actually a few have. And so I would suspect 5 years from now, the 2018 grants, I'd hope 100% of those did deliver, or a high percentage of those did deliver on what they promised. So this would be one of these outputs where you can look at from an effectiveness perspective and were they effective at delivering what they said they would? Now, if you look at the various 5 areas that the tree fund funds, actually it's pretty well distributed upon many of them, with root and soil management having about 25% of the research funds. And specifically, we had a couple other areas. Actually, outside of those 5 areas, you may have noticed there's a specific utility arborist fund. And so there have been a few utility arborist papers or grants funded along with pruning. And so this was one you could maybe put inside of urban forestry, but we felt it was better to actually just bring out that 5% of the projects that have been funded were pruning specific. And you'll hear some additional insight into the importance of the pruning aspect here later. One other additional aspect is if you look at who actually gets funded and then actually the training of students. Undergraduates, which would be UG or MS for masters, or PhD, would be doctoral candidates. That it's a mix of students throughout those different capabilities. Now, this is a low number. This was one of these items that we were unable to build upon the actual number of students. That all we could rely on is what the researchers actually provided to us, and the ability to actually build up this number to the actual number of students funded would be important. So this would be one recommendation we made to the tree fund, is specifically ask the researchers, actually, who are you funding and at what level? Because this is very important to not only know, but even more important from a an outcome or an impact perspective. You're training tomorrow's scientists today. And so one of these things is, many of us could probably allude to this. You get trained in a professional field, and it's really hard if you really enjoy what you're doing, you've got all this time invested, so moving into another area becomes a little more challenging. So actually getting, I'd say, students hooked on being the researchers of arboriculture and urban forestry is very important. And actually one recommendation we made is, undergraduate research. As we found, people are funding this, and specifically maybe developing a low-cost funding source to support undergraduate researchers. Now, if we look at one of the other areas, where are the outputs of papers published? The ISA journal, Arboriculture and Urban Forestry, by far has been the number one where most people have published. Nearly half the papers have been actually published in that periodical, along with the Urban Forestry and Urban Greening is number 2, with a little over 10%. Now, the nice thing, again, about being in something like arboriculture, urban forestry is the open access. So a year after it's been published, anybody has access to this. Now, in other journals, an author can actually have it as an open access paper, but they have to pay for that right. And so if I have a paper in urban forestry and urban greening, I could pay as a researcher $1,000 to actually then have this paper non-embargoed, is the term we'd use. So anybody would have access to read that research findings from day one. Now, 2 important things, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Andrew to talk about some important missions here, is if we look at where knowledge gets created and gets disseminated. So the creation of knowledge is what we do as academics. So we create information and we publish it. So for example, 175 peer-reviewed publications with over 3,600 citations, and almost 1 paper per grant was developed. Now the dissemination part is where a scientist not only takes their findings, and they would transfer it in what we'd call technology transfer. And so technology transfer would be a publication in a peer-reviewed journal or a popular article. So then taking this information and disseminating it in, for example, Arborist News or Tree Care Industry of America, and getting it down to a level where a practitioner would read this and actually then implement the science in their daily practice. Another formats is things such as websites, and Andrew showed an example from Dr. Gilman's website down at the University of Florida. Another possibility is professional presentations. So these are additional things that were very challenging to actually track. And would be one recommendation that we made to the Tree Fund, is perhaps require this upon researchers to actually provide this information. All right, Andrew.
Okay, so for content analysis, what we did is we looked at all the, actually I should say my students looked at all of the abstracts, read them over, and kind of got a feel of what were the natural groupings of the research that was published in from the Tree Fund. And you can see here that, root management and soil management, that was probably the most common was the most common thing that was funded. But planting establishment papers are the most common that we actually see at the end of the pipeline. Probably because they're quick and easy to do. You only need maybe 2 years to do them. So we had, a range of studies from amendments to mulching, planting depth, 8 studies just on that alone. Plant healthcare, there were quite a few studies on that, mostly with, really noxious diseases like EAB or Asian longhorn beetle, where they generate a lot of interest over a short amount of time. Then, roots and fertilization, and risk and tree worker safety, and then urban forestry, and then pruning, being 5 in the other category. A lot of people, when we gave this presentation to the board, the tree fund, they were actually surprised at, how few papers came out in the pruning sector, just showing that even though it's something that arborists commonly do on a daily basis, maybe there's still some need to look into that. Next. So, we showed you a lot of facts and figures before, and now this is a little bit more fun. This is going to be some of the things that I was just thinking, in looking at all the content, what are some things that we kind of take for granted and kind of think of as givens in our industry now that are derived from the tree fund? And one of the things is, or derived in part from the tree fund. So one of the things I came up with when looking at the synopsises in our main report, which you can all access, is that smaller trees establish faster than larger trees. And that there's a number of people that did research on this, but here's one paper from Ed Gilman, which showed how tree size and container stock, they actually establish faster and they grow faster when planted a smaller size in the sands here of Florida. So next slide, Nick. So common belief 2, mulching is good for trees. It's amazing. I moved down to Florida, and it's, some people still don't get this message, but most of the arboricultural world that I've experienced knows that, it's like apple pie, motherhood, and mulching, the 3 good things in this country. So, sorry, Rich. I like it when I can get you to laugh. So anyways, one of the greatest papers out of these is a meta-analysis from Brian Scherenbrock. He looked at, I think, like 30 some papers, and he made a nice figure, and he showed, of all the things that we try to do to improve the health of trees and improve their rooting environments, adding compost, adding mulch were among the best things for many different aspects of soil health. Next slide. And another common belief that deep planting is bad, or it's kind of bad. We're not really sure. One of the things that's cool about the tree fund is they funded multiple projects on this topic. So we found out that it's not just a clear-cut case where when you plant a tree too deep, it's doomed. There are cases where if the soils are deep and well drained, or if the species is resilient and can grow and just root flare, this isn't as big of a problem. And it just runs the board. It's something you have to consider, and it's something you need to think about avoiding, but it's not always going to have the worst. It's not a dire situation all the time. So next slide. Oh, this is cool. If anyone here has heard the term mass dampening, raise your hand. I can't see it. I'm assuming there's some hands raised. This is something that's relatively new to a lot of us, but this is something that Ken James and his partners kind of, brought up, that, lion's tailing. We used to think that was a good way to keep a tree very, wind resistant. You take away all that sail from the interior of the tree, and now that thing will be less prone to breaking in a storm. Well, branches, they collide into each other in the interior. They sway the opposite way of the wind because they kind of spring back. And that mass dampening effect disperses the load of trees. And when we cut out the interior branches, like you see in this picture, we actually do more harm than good. And that's something that came out of tree fund research. Other things, we can engineer better planting spaces. There's some really cool long-term research showing the potential of, permeable pavements, porous pavements, and then structural soils. This one right here, Jason Grabowski and Nina Basic, they had 17 years worth of growth data for street trees, and I believe in the study the trees in the actual structural soil did better than the tree lawn trees because they don't have mower damage and all the other stuff that goes along with being in turf. So next slide. Oh, and for the pruning, so that we had 5 projects that were funded in the pruning realm. I think most of them, if not all of them, were Ed Gilman's work. And through that work, Ed was really good at coming up with rules and things that we can use in the field. So he showed this the beauty of reduction cuts for subordinating codominates to make one central leader if you're looking for that for training. And he kind of gave us things like the third rule, like looking to a lateral that's a third the size of the parent stem when you're trying to exert dominance and make sure that you get the right branch to take off where you want it to go. So next slide, Rich. Another thing that we often hear and repeat in our field is that fertilizing at planting doesn't help, right? It just can stress the plant out more because it needs to deal with the water stress and everything that comes with transplant shock. And often if it's a container tree, it actually has fertilizer still in the root ball, and that's come from Tree Fund as well. Susan Day's on both these papers, and that title says it all. Fertilization of red maple and little leaf linden trees at recommended rates does not aid tree establishment. That's one of those titles where you don't have to go any further if you don't want to, but if you want to see what they did and see what the Tree Fund paid for, you can do that right there. Next, Rich. So those are things that I think you're probably familiar with, at least many of those things were, and we can attribute that to the Tree Fund research, which is pretty cool. That's what 15 years of funding gave you. But here are some other things that may or may not be on your radar that I thought were pretty cool in reading the research archives and the abstracts. Greg Dahl and Jason Grabowski, they were looking at ways to make it really easy to specify pruning, and they found that when if you're thinking about like dosage, there's a bunch of different ways that you can like prescribe like how much of a tree to cut, but they found that the actual cut size, like the width or the diameter of the branch that's being cut, it's an easy thing that kind of relates to everything very well. So you don't have to like worry about what's the best measure. You could just use cut size and put that into your specifications, like cut branches over 4 inches or whatever, and that does it for you. Gilman, we have a lot of problems with container trees. The root balls circle. If they're planted deep enough, the circling roots can girdle the stem. And how do you deal with that? A lot of people worked on different containers that would correct this issue, but Gilman showed that the most effective method that he tested was to just take a knife or a shovel and shave the outer inch or 2 centimeters of roots out off the entire outside of the ball, and then make sure that that thing's watered enough to regrow and deal with that minor stress. And if a tree's irrigated well, it bounces back like nothing. One of the things that Rich and I have worked on is we've been kind of looking into wire basket and burlap removal, and we found now on several papers that you do whatever makes your heart sing. Honestly, if removing the ball and the basket and the burlap make you happy, do it. If keeping it on make you happy, do it. It's going to be the same thing either way. So, next slide, Rich. Ground penetrating radar. I see this more and more for utilities, and we've been looking at it. Nina Bassick and others have been looking at it to detect roots under pavement, and have had success with bigger roots. One of my students found that in doing risk assessments, just showing up to a tree during your lunch hour when everyone else is getting lunch can actually make you rate a tree higher for risk. 6 out of 10 arborists, if they come to the tree on a busier part of the day, will raise their risk rating of that tree. And a cool thing that Brian Kane found, they gave carabiners out to several practicing arborists. They let them use them for an entire year out in the field, and then brought them back in to have strength tests compared to brand new ones out of the box. And they found that in normal arboricultural practice, there was no strength loss in the products that they tested. That's the kind of stuff the Tree Fund's funding. Next slide, Rich. Next slide. Thank you.
So you got all right, so the key informant interviews. This was as I mentioned earlier, one of these things in when you do a scientific method that sometimes you have to deviate. And so initially we're going to call all our key informants, and they're going to have this nice conversation on the phone. Andrew and I are going to record their information as quick as we could, and life would be good. And after 0 for 8, it was a different approach. And in retrospect, as I pointed out, I'm glad this happened. So one of the questions we actually asked folks, actually there was 3 of them, but it dealt with the importance of the tree fund grants as a funding source. And for the research that was funded by the tree fund and the overall outcome of tree fund research grants. And so what we discovered was actually most of these key informants actually were very, very positive, to the point of 1 being a very unimportant ranking, 7 being the most important or very important. And in only 1 case was there a researcher that, or in key informants, suggested that it was a neutral on the importance of research funded by the tree fund. But for the most part, it was very encouraging that the key informants, people that are industry experts that work in these various sectors, from public to private to utility and academics and nonprofits, rated the tree fund as being an overall very important source for outcomes and as a funding source for researchers. Now, we didn't point this out, but for Andrew, myself, and the team that actually are part of this research project, we had no intended outcome of our research findings. Regardless of our outcome, as scientists, we are going to lay out the facts. So this is the facts that came from the key informants. Now, given research funded by the tree fund, have work practices changed? And so out of the 17 people responded, 100% said yes, which was encouraging. And I would hope that this would be the case, and certainly the key informants could actually give us many, many examples, which I'll talk about next. And so, for example, if we're looking at the importance of the priorities, so these 5 priority areas plus the pruning and utility that we added to the study here, we discovered that utility forestry was the lowest ranked. Now, you may look at this and be a little discouraged, but put in perspective, the utility arborist fund has only been around for a couple of years. And so from a baseline perspective, the findings from this research could be used by the tree fund not only to evaluate what's happening right now, plus over the last 15 years, but then to reevaluate 5 or 10 or 15 years down the road to see how it changed. I would suspect and I'd hope that utility forestry indicator would increase, because given time, the impacts from the utility forestry grants just haven't probably been around long enough. Same thing with workplace safety and the ability to work more efficiently. The Safe Arborist Techniques Fund is also more recent. And so it doesn't surprise me as a researcher that these also were lower than pruning or planting and establishment or root and soil management or urban forestry for that matter. These have been around since 2003. And so various researchers were doing research in these areas. And so now we have a 15-year time period to actually say, has there been an impact or an outcome that a key informant could say, yes, I've actually noticed this and I'm going to tell you about that. And so one area that we looked at was for the themes of practice was if we look at a theme of practice by definition, we used this term, an application of arboriculture and urban forestry used to culture and maintain a tree. And so this is what they're using as definition. And that also results in an outcome of the sponsored research that influences change in the industry. And so actually from the key informant words, and so this was an open-ended response where they provided a lot of text to describe the impact and the outcome of the tree fund, 17 themes of practice and 62 unique words. And by the way, we have a publication that I believe is actually now available on the tree fund that actually goes into much greater detail than what Andrew and I presented today. And so, for example, I'll just touch on a few of these themes of practice and unique words in the next few slides. But if you want to see the full-blown report, you can go to the tree fund and actually download this. Plus, when Andrew is talking about all this neat, cool outcomes of the science, there's a bibliography, an annotated bibliography that there's 3 to 5 sentences that describe every one of the research papers we read. So some of you actually that have been around for a long period of time probably remember before the www was commonly available, and you could actually use a Google search to get a publication. You'd actually go to an annotated bibliography where a researcher would take a lot of time to tell you the best science. And so actually we kind of did that, that you can easily then look at these 175 papers and in a matter of 2 hours, get a great level of knowledge. And so one thing that popped out from our research was funding, marketing, and technology transfer were themes that were just repeatedly over and over that came out from the key informants. So from funding, words such as leverage and seed funding and emerging scientist funding were words. So for example, leverage, I give you $1 and $2.63 on average is translated from other research funds. Seed funding, and so a $5,000 or $10,000 research project may stimulate a question that you then actually have a really good research question to then go to another research funding source to answer that. Or emerging scientist. And so this was something that was suggested as perhaps the tree fund could have a funding source that actually is dedicated specifically to emerging scientists. I don't disagree with that statement at all, but I can tell you through our analysis, indirectly, there was a lot of early and upcoming researchers over the history of the Tree Fund and its predecessor, the ISA Research Trust Fund, that actually got started with these 5,000. Oh, by the way, when it started, the Tree Fund, it was a $500 grant. That was the first one ever issued, and the research grant folks that came up with this stuff 30 years ago thought this was great. And it was important, but certainly a $500 didn't cover much back then, let alone today. Marketing, this report and the findings that we find or we discovered actually gives away to the donors to say, actually, your dollars went to work. They weren't wasted. Many of these dollars actually go to research, not overhead of the tree fund per se. The impact from the research itself, we had many good examples that Andrew presented that give a nice succinct outcome of the research. Plus, we found methods, or we found outcomes here of the research actually being translated very directly to tree care professionals, and the research is being applied actually on a daily basis. And then the technology transfer, and this is very, very important. So research just being discovered and being stored away in a laboratory, that's well and good enough for the researcher and the team involved with it. But if it doesn't get out to the masses, it's like it never happened. And so we did find ways that this was occurring through the tree fund research. Now we had 20 or 41 tangible outcomes, and for example, of these outcomes, and we could also I'll use the phrase impact here. So take the ANSI A300 standards. So part 1 is the pruning standard, and there's many examples of the A300 actually having language changed to actually take the science and the research from the tree fund grants that impacted pruning, impacted planting, for example, impacted tree structural support systems. But for part 1 in particular, the pruning standard that was recently revised a little over a year and a half ago did rely greatly on a lot of the research of Dr. Gilman. And so that is a long-lasting impact of practitioners on a daily basis for work that's specified under this standard system are making a difference in the way trees are pruned and maintained these days. Things such as planting standards, not only at the national Z60.1 level that has been influenced actually on the deep planting part, for example, but local planting standards at Florida and California have been influenced by research outcomes from the tree fund. Things such as benchmarking with the municipal forestry survey that was done in 2016, assessment protocols. And so influencing of local to international standards have been huge, and also providing a much needed set of information that practitioners on a daily basis use to maintain and manage urban trees. In the heart of the mission of the Tree Fund, that's what it's really all about, is not just doing research, but making practical research outcome and findings that are translated to the masses. And so if you look at the whole list of themes of impact, the outcomes, a lot of different words. All the way from A to W. We didn't get X, Y, and Z yet, perhaps over the next few years, those letters will come out. But as you can see, a lot of things from the Biomechanics Week or over the decades, practical outcomes, safety, webinars, wealth of information, all important stuff that the key informants told us about. The last slide, and then we'll turn it back over to questions, is webinars. I'm proud to be able to present with Andrew. Fantastic friend, a great researcher, person I love to collaborate with. But being on this webinar is just one of many. When we did the work, actually 12 were already held. And there is nearly 5,000 viewers, and this is estimated. And this is actually a static number. After this webinar occurs today, they'll tally up the number of people that actually did participate. They'll be one of the viewers. But something that came out from this research that is actually after the fact is these webinars are actually hosted. And a person can, a year from now, 6 months from now, 6 weeks from now, and perhaps some of you on this call today want to relook at this as a rerun. Feel free to. Those people actually aren't captured. So the technology transfer through these webinars that Utah and Alabama Extension are hosting and providing the expertise is important. About 400 people on average view a webinar. When we did the work, the highest was 550. I've actually heard of one of the webinars actually had 800 people that said they were going to participate, which is just huge. So technology transfer of the tree fund through this hosted webinar series, such as we're on today, is very important for translating this information. So I thank each of you for actually listening today, and we'll turn it over to any questions that you have, and we do actually have one, and Andrew, feel free to chime in. So it's from I won't read the name of the person. I know the individual, a great question, but thanks us for the informative webinar, but does have a question. Why does ISA have a 1-year delay before the research is available to the general public? Is it strictly a financial decision? Well, I could say directly for all journals, it costs money to put things into publication, and yeah, actually financing the transfer of science is important. And so in the ISA's case, actually, this is a membership benefit. And so if you're a member of ISA for your $135 annual membership, you can either get a printed copy of Arborist News or Journal of Arboriculture, Urban Forestry. But at a minimum, you can get both of these electronic. And so after a 1-year period, they nicely actually translate all this information to the masses at no cost, which from a financial perspective, you can make the argument ISA would be better off selling access, but they've made a decision. Memberships are financing this, and then after a year, getting the information out to the masses is very important. Any additional insight, Andrew?
No, I remember when I worked at ISA, we had discussions around this, and they really did want to open up the information, and I think it just comes down to they worried that the membership would be upset if they, lost that membership benefit. Be one less thing that would differentiate what someone's paying for than from what anyone could have. So. Yeah,
and myself personally, and of several 30,000 members, I would have no issue of this being translated as the day it gets printed to the masses. I could see as from a board of directors perspective, if I was making the decision, I'd say, well, why then have memberships? Because a person could just get this information at no cost. I don't think that'd be an issue, but per se, I'm happy that ISA actually doesn't have an embargo beyond a year, which is nice. Andrew, can you see the comments at all?
Yeah, it says, are trees planted in structural soil better than regular sidewalk? It depends on a lot of things. The structural soil really helps in situations where there's a lot of compaction that would need to go down as a road base, and sidewalks typically they don't really need that as much, so they you just have regular soil underneath the sidewalk, and that leads to a lot of other issues, which sidewalk lifting and things like that. So Rich, want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Andrew, you hit it very well. It's all about the soil itself. And so what is the tree planting area? Is it actually a nice amenable soil that you can put a shovel in very easily? Or is it the phrase they use in a town in Ohio called the Devil's Pit, where it's a tree lawn area? But when I think of the Devil's Pit, this is compacted, aggregate-filled soil that is kind of challenging because of root penetration. It's a very compacted soil. On the other hand, the structural soil is going to give you a mechanism to take the load. And between the aggregate, you have a soil area for tree roots to explore. So I think that's the key thing right there, is what is the soil like? So
Anonymous attendee, urbanization is a huge trend. Do you foresee more research in urban forestry in the coming years? And I have to say that I've kind of seen a lot of, a trend in the hiring. There's been a lot of positions at Michigan State, Delaware, a lot of historically black, colleges in the United States. There's been kind of like an influx of new hires as of the last 5 years. Would you say, Rich?
Oh, huge. And you look beyond the United States. You look at North America and Canada and the program they built at University of British Columbia in Vancouver, or Asia Pacific, and the number of researchers that are being developed in various countries throughout the world is becoming huge. Now, as a scientist and a researcher, would I like to see many more urban foresters and arborists actually take this on as a research area? Oh, for sure. And we're certainly not saturated, but I do see some promising things that have occurred at the international level in the recent time period. Next question: what are the top subjects from the tree fund which drew the largest participation? And actually, Andrew, did you have a comment on the last question?
No, I think Bo could probably best add to this one, but I think, didn't Nina Bassix really top out, or was it, James Urbans maybe?
I think pruning.
I think it was Jim Urban's. Are we talking about webinars?
Oh,
yeah, webinar.
Webinars, like the most.
Yeah, I think Jim Urbans is the one that clipped the scales at almost 1,000 the last time. But I was just going to mention for the soil compaction question, Nina Bassik is going to be presenting on June 11th on her webinar, so it might be a good time to tune in for that one.
Great.
I was wrong on the pruning. I guess we got to go to Jim Urban.
So Jim Urban, he does like designing planting spaces for trees that are functional and still do everything that we want to do. So that root kind of...
Well, UW Stevens Point hosts the world's largest trivia event. They just had their 50th one this past year, so maybe that'll be one of the trivia questions. Which tree fund webinar had the greatest draw of participants? So Mark, I'll actually send that to the trivia folks here on campus.
And then lastly, what time we have? Yeah, maybe we'll just end with Amy's then. Did the review reveal which technically to transfer? So I would say the lit review did not say which is the most effective technology transfer method. Anecdotally, when I worked at ISA, like having this kind of conversation back and forth, either through a webinar or a chapter meeting or the international meeting, we've always thought that was kind of the main way that a lot of people get their information. Like the CEU articles draw a lot of attention and stuff like that are in Arborist News, but having this seems to be the best. Would you say so, Rich?
I would. Actually, if you think like these questions that come up after webinar, these are always, first of all, they put us on a spot thinking, okay, do we have a good answer to this great question? And thinking about, technology transfer, I agree exactly with Andrew said. If you think about the way people learn, it's actually, people learn very well by hearing something, and maybe they master 30% of it. Then if they see it, they master maybe another 30%. But if I show them and actually teach them and instruct them how to do it, and they do it hands-on experiential, that's usually one of the best ways to learn. So this kind of format, or even more importantly, an interactive experience in person, or maybe actually through a chat line such as these questions, is a way to dynamically answer a question and then get the feedback back and forth. So I want to thank everyone for actually participating and listening today. And I do want to point out again, the full-blown report that will be on the exam later next month is 64 pages of fun. And